I'm Doug Farrer, and this is The World Unpacked.
Negotiations over the Iran nuclear deal are restarting today in Vienna. Talks ended.
Has claimed a new victory in the long-running war on the Islamic State group. The leader of ISIS died last night when American commandos raided his hideout in Syria.
For the first 2 decades of the 21st century, American foreign policy fixated on the Middle East. But with Asia now central to U.S. policy, what role does the Middle East play in U.S. grand strategy? Joining me from Beirut to unpack this topic is Maha Yahya, the director of the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center. Here we go. Maha, welcome to the show.
It's lovely to be here.
And you're a repeat offender here, so we're glad to have you back. So let's start. Brett McGurk, the lead at the National Security Council for the Middle East, recently said that the U.S. is not going anywhere and that the region was too important to American interests to contemplate otherwise. Do you think this accurately characterizes U.S. engagement in the Middle East?
Yes and no, Doug. I think yes, to the extent that the region, the U.S. is still engaged in the region and has a series of strategic objectives. No, in the sense that the U.S. is pivoting in a big way away from the region. And I think it's not doing enough to achieve its goals.
So how would you characterize the primary goals of the U.S. in the Middle East today?
I would say there are basically 3 goals. The first is obviously the nuclear deal with Iran, a return to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as a means of avoiding a nuclear arms race in the region. That's the number one priority. Second priority is de-escalating tensions and the creation of a stable regional environment, mainly between Iran and Gulf countries. As the United States disengages militarily from the Middle East, the aim of this also is the protection of maritime trade and global maritime trade lines. And then the third objective, I would say, is a continuation of its longstanding focus on combating terrorism that posits a threat to the U.S. homeland, its partners, its allies, or its interests.
I want to go deeper on Iran. It's being reported that negotiations may conclude and that Iran may even rejoin the deal. It's simultaneously being reported that they're much closer to producing enough weapons-grade material to create a bomb. So I'd be curious if you could give your views on Biden's strategy on the Iran deal. Is he right to try to return to the deal?
I think he's right to try and return to the deal. My main concern is that we're returning to the deal without any other. Again, we're only focusing on the deal and excluding all of Iran's other destabilizing activities in the region. At the end of the day, especially given the extent to which Iran has upped its capacity in terms of producing uranium-grade or weapons-grade uranium, there's a lot of concern that a return to the deal and the lifting of some economic sanctions is going to allow Iran to be able to expand its regional footprint in the region or deepen it even further than it already has. Basically, it will allow it to support, to provide further financial support to its proxies in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Yemen. Its proxies in Iraq mainly are being supported by the Iraqi state. So it will allow it to expand and increase its destabilizing activities across the region. So while the US is right in pursuing the objective of a non-nuclear Iran, the kind of very narrow focus, the blinders on only we focus on the nuclear issue and not look into the ballistic missiles, or we don't include any discussion of Iran's regional activities in and of itself will serve to destabilize the region further down the road.
I think folks at the NSC and the Biden administration might say that they have a choice, right? Which is to try to limit Iran's nuclear program or try to restrict the activities of Iran's proxies, but it's too hard to do both. I wonder what you think of that argument.
I think it's we don't have the luxury of not pursuing both at the same time. Right now, what's happening is by focusing solely on the JCPOA and excluding any kind of track on the other issues, you end up in a situation where your goals actually end up undermining each other. Pursuing one goal is contradictory to the pursuit of another goal or a key priority for you. So while I understand the issues of bandwidth, we just don't have the luxury of this kind of singular focus only on the JCPOA or only on the Iran deal. There's even discussion of a less for less deal where, you freeze enrichment and then you release some economic sanctions. Now, one of the things the US has tried to do is to try and say, okay, let the region take care of Iran's destabilizing activities and let them sort out their problems. But that also is not working, because without US support to a real dialogue between the different regional partners, it's going to be impossible for this to happen.
Let's turn to conflict in the region. The Houthi rebels from Yemen attacked sites in the UAE. Things seem very unstable, and the U.S. seems disengaged on trying to de-escalate these regional conflicts. What's the prognosis for stability in the region, given this U.S. disengagement?
What I would say is that the U.S. is, I don't know that it's disengaging completely, but it needs to engage more diplomatically, as I was saying earlier. The main concern is that the bandwidth of the Biden administration is occupied by a large number of global challenges. And the amount of time it is kind of using to focus on the Middle East is much smaller than before. What this means in time is that the kind of diplomatic efforts that need to be put into stabilizing the region and making sure that the trade-offs between the actions taken under the different goals, US goals for the region, don't end up undermining each other. There needs to be a concerted effort to actually look at the region and look at the problems, the interconnections between these problems, and how actions in one area destabilize actions in another area. So I think this is where the main concern is. It's not that it's disengaging. It's not about the military even disengagement. There is still some military presence across the region. It's more about the diplomatic effort that is needed, where I think we're falling short in a significant way.
You mentioned military engagement. Last week, U.S. forces killed a leader of ISIS in a raid in Syria. There was also the U.S. engagement with the prison in Syria that was housing ISIS captives. So, U.S. counterterrorism operations go on, and you've actually once described that those operations as a game of whack-a-mole. Is this just going to go on forever and ever?
Unfortunately, yes. Because when you look at terrorism in isolation of the broader political and socioeconomic environment in the region, of countries in the region, yes, it's justified in the shadow of crimes that these extremist groups have committed. But by isolating it from its broader environment, it's just meaningless because it won't lead to long-term solutions. Basically, what we're seeing today is that there isn't sufficient focus. I mean, there have been some stabilization initiatives that the U.S. has undertaken in a number of different parts of the region, particularly places like Krakow, for example, to rebuild some of what was destroyed in the conflict against ISIS. But this is really peanuts compared to what needs to be done. If we don't look seriously at the kind of fundamental regional tensions, the conflicts, the politicization of sectarian identities, the massive socioeconomic inequalities, the underdevelopment, and now climate change will also play a bigger role, increasingly bigger role. These triggers of discontent, which actually drove people to the street in 2011, are still very much part and parcel of life in this region today. And they've become a lot worse in the past decade. And they've also been aggravated by the pandemic. So unless there is a real serious look at these issues and an attempt to address some, and this is not just for the US. The US has to work with its partners, has to work with countries in the region, and put these as part of its priorities when talking about stabilization in the region. Then we will continue playing a whack-a-mole situation.
For as long as I can remember, the U.S. has been trying to work on issues like economic inequality, political exclusion, and corruption in the Middle East. I guess there's a sense here that we've tried and we failed to make any difference on these domestic issues. And if you pair that with a rising isolationist sentiment, sort of encapsulated in Donald Trump's America First policy objectives, you sort of ask the question, does the U.S. really need to be involved in internal issues, and can they make a difference on what are domestic issues in Middle Eastern states?
Its capacity to make a difference has decreased, especially because of the number of players now that are occupying the Middle East. However, yes, it can make a difference. The US is still is a global power. Countries in the region still look to the US for support, for partnership, for protection, etc. So it can leverage some of these relationships to encourage a change, more fundamental change than is currently the case. I'll give just one example. Tunisia, the silence, in a sense, it's not total silence, but the relative silence on the ongoing coup, which is continuing in Tunisia, what is happening under President Kais Saied is just astonishing. This is a country that was seen as the apple in the eye of the Arab Spring. It was the one country where the political consensus became the rule of the game. People were proud of the peaceful transfer of power between presidents from one parliament to the other, etc. In the space of less than a year, in 6 months, we've seen a tremendous regression when it comes to democratic nation building and to the way democracy functions. The last of which there was a announcement, I think yesterday. He just dissolved the Constitutional Court. So the same goes for Sudan, etc. So I think that the US policymakers can definitely make a difference when they take a stand, when they push for the right policy mix, and when they say this is, this just will not work for us. They can leverage the relationships they have with these countries, because ultimately, this is frankly, if no one does that, then this region will not only remain unstable, but it will also export instability globally. What happens in this region does not stay in this region, as we all know very well.
You mentioned a U.S. policy mix, and the region is huge, and each of the states in the region have their own objectives and relate to U.S. interests differently. But I'm wondering if you can come up with a couple principles from which the U.S. can create a smart policy for the Middle East.
I would say a number of policy directions, maybe. There is the promotion of a regional security architecture and regional development. The idea here is that there are issues in the region, not all of them political, that can only be dealt with at the regional level. I'll give the example of climate change and water issues, water stress. And we're actually seeing some movement on this. For example, now there's a meeting between Syria, Turkey, and Iraq on water issues. So in some places, you can create converging interests around issues that can, and this is not something that the US alone can do, or the US necessarily needs to be involved in every single one of them, but it can help push in that direction, that there needs to be a regional approach to certain issues, whether it's security, whether it's development. In terms of security, the United States could also encourage and facilitate a collective regional position with regards to the nuclear weapons of Iran or others, and also a collective position in terms of how do you address the negative repercussions of Iran's regional behavior. This could also include Turkey, given the country's regional role and economic ties with Iran, not just Gulf countries. So I think there are different ways that this could also at least this trend, this push could materialize and unfold. It also, as I said, it could be tied with a discussion of regional development that all sides would gain from. especially since Gulf countries today are very concerned about how do you ensure economic growth, not only in a post-pandemic environment, but also in a post-hydrocarbons area. Insecurity in the region has had a very negative impact on development and growth. And threats to security, as we said earlier, have socioeconomic roots, whether it's competition over natural resources, economic and social inequalities, economic and political exclusion, etc. So a regionally integrated approach to economic development, including trade and transport, climate change, etc., would really help in promoting the interests of everyone.
What about the significance of regional dialogues? How can the U.S. engage there?
So as the negotiations over the JCPOA are running their course, the United States really should build on, for example, the Saudi-Iranian negotiations, to try and extract commitments from both sides to stabilize the Levant and Yemen, which is where this rivalry in some cases, malign activities in others, is really playing out. There are talks that Baghdad is trying to mediate, but I think the United States can also work with other partners to ensure that the outcome has a bearing on the situation in key zones of confrontation. For example, the agenda can include a timeline for regional escalation in both Yemen and Lebanon, an area where Iran has very heavy vested interests. There are incentives that Washington can provide, such as the lifting of sanctions in some areas. So in return for specific Iranian commitments in Lebanon, for example. So there is a regional dialogue that needs to take place over Syria. This is really missing at this point. What we're seeing is a move to normalize with the Assad regime, without any concern for accountability for the horrific crimes that were committed over the past decade, without any concern for questions of accountability, justice, or even refugees. Refugees continue to be framed as a humanitarian issue. This is a fundamentally political issue. People will not go back to Syria unless they have guarantees that they will be safe and that there's a minimal, a framework for them to survive. This conversation is simply not happening. So this is a place where also the US can push for a more meaningful discussion. So I think ultimately, despite the global challenges, the need for a more cohesive US policy engagement in the region really has never been greater.
After the break, I'll ask Maha about how U.S. disengagement affects climate, Russia, China, and more in the Middle East. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
The Biden administration wants to turn its foreign policy focus away from the Middle East and redeploy those resources towards countering Russia and China.
We'll be much more formidable to our adversaries.
Let's start with climate. And really, let's focus on the energy transition, because oil accounts for such a huge percent of the GDP of a number of states in the Middle East. And as these countries transition towards renewable energy, along with the rest of the world, is that an existential threat to the stability and governance of those nations and this region?
I think that the energy transition, if not handled properly, could become an existential threat. Unfortunately, when we talk about bad governance in the region, this isn't just on the political front, but it's also at every single level, including the dealing with the issues of climate change, but also with the issues of the transition from a hydrocarbon towards a post-hydrocarbon era. And here again, there's lots of differences, obviously, in the region. Whereas you see Gulf countries trying to now move forward very fast with adopting energy efficient industries, focusing on green growth, looking at investments, diversifying their economic investments away from the hydrocarbon industry. It's still it's not enough yet. the kinds of investments that are needed, the know-how, but also even the understanding of how to manage some of these resources at the local level, and how to do this kind of the needed energy transition in ways that involve the public sector, the private sector, external investors, etc., is still not there. The research and development that is needed, that needs to go into this also, is not where it needs to be. And it's definitely not uniform across the region.
As revenues from oil go down, obviously these states, some of which are authoritarian and sort of supporting themselves on what is functionally patronage, their ability to continue to provide that goes down. So what kind of effect will that have on different states in the Middle East?
This will have a very detrimental effect. Now, of course, again, it differs from place to place, but we're already seeing this the impact of shrinking resources on the governing elite. There's an authoritarian resurge across the region. There's basically it's authoritarianism without the social bargain that underpinned it. So in the past, most of these regimes were able to rule with an iron fist, but they provided a lot of social services, handouts that were actually billed as handouts to the broader public, jobs in the public sector, insurance, etc. Their capacity to do the social part is simply no more there. They cannot. The public sector has to shrink, has to be brought down to size. Investments in social services and other kinds of services are not there. Basically, these states are abdicating their role in terms of the protection for their citizens. This means that there's going to be more and more discontent on the street. And it will manifest in, I think, both a greater authoritarian grip on populations, and possibly greater violence at the local level. But this will play out over years. It's not a matter of a year or two. And at the same time, we have to keep in mind that the people in this region, there's a barrier of fear that was broken. And I know it now sounds like a cliche, but it's not. There is a barrier of fear that was broken in 2011, and people discovered the value of their voices. So they're not afraid to go out and say, you know what, this is not enough. We need more.
I want to turn to great power politics a little bit, because obviously with the U.S. turning its attention elsewhere, there are other major powers for whom the Middle East is a vital region. And I want to start with Russia, who's reinvigorated its foreign policy on the back of their engagement with Syria. Can you talk a little bit about how Russia benefits, or how the regional players think about Russia as the United States starts to disengage?
Basically, as the post-Cold War order and imposed by Pax Americana has dissipated, Russia has definitely stepped into the fray in a very significant way. It's bolstered its geopolitical standing and its influence in the Mediterranean and in North Africa. We're looking at its involvement. It's not just in Syria, where it's playing a very big and important role in both maintaining the Assad regime, but it's also negotiating, even at the local level, different what they call as ceasefire arrangements. It's also it will have a significant role in determining what the shape of an ultimate political solution in Syria would look like. Now, I focus on Syria because Syria is a large country, and it's geopolitically, it's centrally located in the Levant. It's incredibly important and will have a significant impact on stability across the region. However, Russia is also involved in Libya through its Wagner group. Russia is also involved in a number of other places. So I think it has what Russia has done basically is attempted to move into the openings that were created by the gradual withdrawal of the US and its pivot towards Asia in a way that has allowed it to become much more proactive in not only pursuing its security interests, but in the sense that it can do things and no one will stop it.
What about the Chinese? Can you talk a little bit about how U.S. disengagement affects their role and relationship in the Middle East?
The Chinese, it's a different ballgame. Whereas with Russia, it's been very much about military involvement. They're very good at military. They haven't been as great on the diplomatic, but they really have been, very involved on the military front. For China, they're interested in their Belt and Road Initiative. They're trying to build up support and link up with countries of the region economically. However, until now, they have not been very proactive about getting involved in the political morass that is this region. While they're willing to side with Russia on UN Security Council issues, for example, when there is negotiations on, cross-border humanitarian aid or other issues of interest, they have not been willing to get involved politically in the region. And I think because this is also historic. I mean, China is historically not been interested in getting into the political game in this particular region. It's more about markets and economic connections than anything else. They also tend to like to work with, it's more of a state-to-state relationship, whereas Russia works perfectly well with military in Syria and with other local proxy groups, whether in Syria, in Iran, in Libya or other places. So it's a different modus operandi, I would say.
Do increased Chinese, by virtue of their economic ties and financing, and Russian engagement militarily, increase or decrease the prospect for stability in the region?
I would say they increase the prospect of instability in the region. Stability a la Russia, as we have seen in Syria, has meant until now keeping a regime in place without any kind of a regime that is responsible, according to the UN, for crimes against humanity in place without any accountability whatsoever. A regime that's having a lot of difficulty governing the rest of the country. So to my mind, that kind of stability is actually the epitome of instability down the road. China, it's more about, again, economic issues. It's tying countries into greater debt, which down the road will also play a role in destabilizing countries that are already suffering from significant socioeconomic challenges, greater inequalities, etc.
I want to return to the United States for my last question. We talk a lot about policymakers. We mentioned Brett McGurk at the start of this episode, but I would be curious what you would say to, sort of the quote unquote average American who might be about my age, about 40 years old, and says, we've been involved in the Middle East my whole life. And when I think of it, I think of terrorism and oil and, failure on our part, Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. And they're asking the question of their elected leaders, should we even be involved in this region? How would you respond to those people?
I would say two things. First, the Middle East is so much more than terrorism. It's a region that is incredibly rich, incredibly diverse, despite the headlines. There is a reason why the Levant was called the cradle of civilization for a long time. So it is an incredibly rich and dynamic region, on the ground, societies, youth, etc., you name it. So the second thing I would say is that the United States cannot afford to look away from the region, because US pivoting away from the region, disengaging completely, is basically setting the world down the road for greater instability. Instability in the region does not stay in the region, unfortunately. It's something that will come out will be felt far beyond the region. And the cost for us is just too huge. And unfortunately, in time, If these things are not addressed now, some of which need to be nipped in the bud, these will only pull the United States back into a region that it really feels it has absorbed too much of its energy.
Maha, thanks for coming back on the show and explaining all of these complicated issues to us.
It was an absolute pleasure, Doug. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. We want to hear from you, so email us at podcasts@ceip.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Douglas L. Farrer. That's Farrar. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a review or a rating. The World Unpacked is produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producers are Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero.